Oh, there you are. You're back for chapter 7. Who remembers what happened in chapter 6? Remember, they got into Narnia, didn't they, all four of them? And they went to see Tumnus the faun. And what happened there? That's right. His cave got all destroyed, didn't it? And so, what came out that they started to think, what's going on? To help them, to lead them somewhere. Do you remember what was leading them somewhere? It was a robin, wasn't it? A very bright, red-breasted, bright-eyed robin. Okay, so chapter 7 starts with a day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin," cried Lucy, "the robin, it flew away." And so it had, right out of sight. They couldn't see it anymore. "Well, and now what are we supposed to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look, which is as much to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh, look," said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving over there in the trees. Just look to the left." So they all stared just as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. These were strange woods, weren't they? They didn't know anybody there. They didn't even know where they were, really. "There it goes again," said Susan. "Well, I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just, well, it went behind that big tree." "What do you think it is?" said Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous, but she maybe was a little bit. "Well, whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. I think it's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's just go home," said Susan, and then, although nobody said it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "Well, what does it look like?" said Lucy. "Well, it's kind of an animal," said Susan. And then, look, there it is. Quick, look." And they all saw it this time, a whiskered, furry face, which had looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately pull back. Instead, the animal put its paw to its mouth, just like a human might put their finger to their lips when they want you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree again, glanced around, just as if it was afraid someone was watching, and said, "Hush." And then it made signs to join it in the thicker bit of woods where it was standing, and then once more it disappeared. "Well, I know what it is," said Beaver. "I saw its tail. It's a beaver." "It wants us to go to it," said Susan, "and, well, it's warning us to be quiet." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we going to go or not? What do you think, Lucy?" "Well, I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Well, shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I do feel I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to come. "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. I'll keep close together, and we ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children all got close together, and they walked kind of slowly up to the tree, and then they went in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back further, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in! Come further in! Right in here! We're not safe in the open." And only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met, and the brown earth and pine needles underneath had no snow on them at all because the snow couldn't get through, only then did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. "Well, we're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud. We're not safe even in here." "Why, what are you afraid of?" said Peter. There's no one here but us." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean," and it nodded its head several times. "Well, if it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you're a friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, of course, Mr. Beaver," said Peter, "but you see, we are strangers." Quite right," said the beaver. "Here is my token," and with these words it held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise, till suddenly Lucy said, "Of course, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave to Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on to—" Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two very mysterious nods, then signaling to the children to stand just as close as they could to it, so that their faces were actually tickled by his whiskers, it added in a low whisper, "They say Aslan is on the move, and perhaps has already landed." And now, a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do, but the moment that Beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it sometimes has happened to you in a dream, that someone says something that you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one or else a lovely meaning. The terrifying one would turn the dream into a nightmare, and a lovely one would mean that it was too lovely to put into words. It makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life, and you're kind of always wishing you could get back into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in his insides. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or a beautiful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy? Well, Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and you realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh, shh, shh," said the beaver. "Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk and have some dinner." Well, no one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. So they hurried all along and behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest for over an hour. By then, everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them, and the ground started to fall steeply downhill in front of them. A minute later, they came out under the open sky. They found the sun was still shining brightly, and they found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, well, at least it would have run if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and they felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver must have made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of a modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "Oh, what a lovely dam." And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush this time, but he said, "Oh, it was merely a trifle. It was nothing. And it isn't really finished yet." Above the dam, there was what ought to have been a deep pool of water, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, this ice was all frozen into foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and beautiful festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive that you would find in the forest. And from a hole in the roof of it, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking, and you became hungrier than you were before. Now that was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river, there was another small river that joined it, which came down another small valley. And looking up that other small valley, Edmund could see two small hills. Do you remember what we heard about two small hills? He was almost sure that they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamppost that other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile or so off. And he thought about Turkish delight. Remember when he ate that delicious Turkish delight? And then he thought about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that when I'm king, he asked himself. And horrible other ideas came into his head. Well, here we are, said Mr. Beaver, and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful, don't slip. Now, the top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not, for humans, the best place to walk on, because it was covered with ice, and though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, on the other side, there was that nasty drop down to the lower river and the ice down below. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in a single file, right out in the middle where they could look a long ways up the river and a long ways down the river. And when they'd reached the middle, well, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a kind of a buzzing sound. And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from that sound, the sound came from that. She stopped work and got up as soon as the children came in. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws to them. At last, to think that ever I should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling, the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish? That I will, said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and he went across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice which he kept open every day with his hatchet. It's a little axe. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. He was looking hard into the hole. Then suddenly his paw shot in, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he whisked out a beautiful, beautiful trout. And then he did it all over again and again until they'd landed a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut some fresh bread and put the plates in the oven to heat up and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in the corner of the house for when he got back. And they put on the frying pan and got it dripping hot with butter. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, kind of like on board some ships. They were built into the wall, and there were 3 hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the wall there were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and other tools, things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks even. And the cloth on the table, although it was very clean, it was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were still frying, and how hungry the children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver finally said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan then drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout. So that in a very few minutes, everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all 3-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire. And they were preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to his beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took just as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing hardly to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and it has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and gloriously sticky marmalade roll. steaming hot. And at the same time, she moved the kettle onto the fire so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, and each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall, and they gave a long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit. Ah, there, now we can get down to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because, well, it means we shan't have any visitors. And if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." And that's the end of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is titled, "What Happened After Dinner?" I wonder what that's going to be. So Chapter 8, that's almost halfway through the book. There's 17 chapters. We're reading, if you recall, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So hopefully you'll come back tomorrow to hear Chapter 8. Okay? See you then.